She laughed at me all week, then vanished on my birthday. Instagram found her first. Resort pool, cocktails, his arm around her chair. 2 hours later, her boss called me. Not to apologize, to panic. That's when I told him the envelope had already been mailed. My name is Clayton Merritt. I'm 57 years old, and I spent 2 decades as a senior investigator in the corporate fraud division at Bridgepoint National Bank. I know how to follow a paper trail the way a bloodhound follows a scent. I know how people hide money, hide trips, hide entire second lives inside spreadsheets and calendar entries. I built a career on that. And somehow, I told myself it didn't apply at home. The week before my 57th birthday, Nadine started in again. It was small stuff at first. A comment at dinner about how I never went big for anything. A remark to her sister on the phone, loud enough for me to hear, about how I was the kind of man who'd give you a gift card and call it thoughtful. She laughed when she said it. Her sister laughed too. I stood in the kitchen doorway listening, and I nodded to myself the way you nod when you finally accept something you already knew. By Thursday, she wasn't even bothering to lower her voice. 29 years, she said over her coffee, not looking up from her phone. And you've never once done anything that actually impressed me. I poured myself a cup, sat down across from her, and said nothing. That was my answer. Silence. Saturday morning, my birthday, I was up at 5:30. I fed Duke, our 9-year-old lab, who looked up at me with those steady amber eyes like he understood the whole situation better than anyone. I made eggs. I drank my coffee standing at the kitchen window, watching the neighbors' sprinklers go off in the dark. Nadine came downstairs at 7, already dressed. New outfit, heels, hair done, a cloud of perfume she only wore when she wanted to feel like someone else. Don't wait up, she said, pulling on her jacket. I'm going to Kristen's. Girls thing. She didn't say happy birthday. She didn't look at me. She just picked up her keys and walked out, and the door clicked shut behind her like a period at the end of a sentence she'd been writing for years. I stood there for a moment. Then I walked to my home office, unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk, and pulled out a manila envelope I'd been building for 14 months. I sealed it with packing tape. I wrote the address by hand. I walked it to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, slid it in, and raised the flag. Then I came back inside, refilled my coffee, and sat down to wait. By noon, my phone buzzed. A notification from Instagram. Nadine had posted. I opened it. There she was, poolside at the Clearwater Palms Resort, 70 miles away, in a white sundress I'd never seen before. Beside her, arm draped across the back of her chair like he owned the furniture, was Derek Payne, her work husband, director of regional accounts, 12 years younger than me, 6 inches shorter, and apparently very good at expense reports. The caption read, "Finally living like we deserve it." Sunglasses emoji. Champagne glass emoji. I didn't like the post. I didn't comment. I put the phone face down on the kitchen table, picked up my fork, and finished my eggs. 2 hours later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let go to voicemail. Then it rang again. This time I recognized the prefix. It was Veridan Pharma's corporate line. Nadine's company. I answered. The voice on the other end belonged to Russell Holt, CEO, and he did not sound like a man calling to wish me a happy birthday. He sounded like a man who just opened something he couldn't close back up. Russell Holt's voice had that particular quality I'd heard 100 times in my career. The voice of a man who just realized the floor wasn't where he thought it was. "Mr. Merritt," he said, "I'm going to be direct with you. We received a submission this morning. A compliance disclosure packet. It's addressed to our VP of Internal Ethics and marked urgent. I've been briefed on the contents, and I need to ask you point blank. Did you compile and submit this document?" I leaned back in my chair. Duke had settled at my feet, chin on my shoe, watching me with that calm he always had. "I did," I said. A beat of silence. Then Russell said, "I see." He wasn't angry. That was the interesting part. He was the kind of man who understood, on a gut level, when he was talking to someone who knew exactly what they were doing. 30 years running a pharmaceutical distribution company teaches you to recognize precision. "Can you tell me," he said carefully, "how long you've been gathering this material?" 14 months, I said. Another pause. "That's thorough." "That's my job," I told him. He asked me to stay available. I told him I had nowhere to be. We hung up. I sat for a moment looking at the kitchen wall. Then I called Grant Donovan, my attorney, and left him a message letting him know the envelope had been received. What was in that envelope had taken me the better part of a year to build. As a senior investigator at Bridgepoint National Bank, I'd spent my career tracing money through systems designed to obscure it. Shell transactions, mislabeled disbursements, invoices for services that never existed. I knew every trick. And when I started quietly looking at Nadine's professional world 14 months ago, I found that the tricks she and Derek Payne had been using weren't even sophisticated. They were lazy. The kind of lazy that happens when nobody's watching. Except someone was watching. The core of it was simple. Derek Payne, director of regional accounts at Veritas Pharma, had been rerouting discretionary client entertainment funds through a series of mislabeled budget lines. Conference fees logged as client dinners. Travel expenses filed as staff development. A spa weekend in Scottsdale relabeled as a territory review summit. And Nadine, as director of pharmaceutical sales for the Southeast region, had been the one authorizing the reclassifications on her end. What made it worse, what turned a disciplinary matter into a full compliance crisis, was that this hadn't started with Derek. I'd found traces going back 5 years, to a previous regional partner named Todd Geary, who'd left the company quietly after restructuring. The pattern was identical. Same budget lines, same reclassification language. Nadine had been running this playbook for years, cycling through different accomplices, refining it each time. Derek was just the current version. And then there was Nolan Graves, Derek's inside man in accounting. Nolan had been quietly adjusting approval timestamps and swapping document file names in the shared drive, so nothing flagged during quarterly reviews. I'd found him through a metadata inconsistency, a file modification timestamp that didn't match the submission log. 7 seconds of sloppiness across 14 months of otherwise careful work. That's all it took. I'd included Nolan's name and a full documentation trail in the packet. Section 4, clearly labeled. By 3 in the afternoon, I had 3 more calls. The first was from Vincent Archer, Veritas VP of Compliance, who wanted to verify the chain of custody on my audio files. I walked him through it methodically. He thanked me with the controlled politeness of a man who had a very long evening ahead of him. The second call was from Grant Donovan, returning my message. I briefed him on the morning. He told me the financial account closures had processed without issue. I'd initiated the joint account separation 8 months ago through the bank's standard spousal asset restructuring protocol. Perfectly legal. Time to complete on this specific date. Grant confirmed that Nadine's name had been removed as a secondary holder on the investment account and that the revised beneficiary structure on my pension was already on file. The third call was from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring. Then a text came through. It was from Derek Payne. We should talk before this gets out of hand. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I read it twice. Set the phone down. Opened the voice memo app. Picked the phone back up and called him. He answered on the second ring. Already talking fast. Already trying to sound reasonable. I let him go for about 90 seconds. He used the word misunderstanding for more times. He implied that Nadine had pressured him. He suggested that both sides had contributed to the situation. He mentioned that he had a family. I said, Derek, I'm going to stop you there. He stopped. Everything you just said, I told him, is now recorded and time-stamped. If you'd like to make a formal statement, I'd suggest doing it through your attorney. Don't call this number again. I ended the call. Saved the file. Added it to the folder on my desktop labeled supplemental. Duke looked up at me from the floor. Good dog, I said. He wagged once and put his head back down. I got the call from Veritas Corporate Travel Insurance Division the next morning at 8:47. The woman on the line was professional, measured, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who spends their days delivering bad news with clinical precision. She identified herself as an investigator from Callaway Risk Management, the firm that underwrote Veritas' commercial travel and entertainment policy. She told me they'd received a disclosure packet the previous day and had spent the evening reviewing it against their claims database. What they found, she said, matched across 14 separate claim filings over the past 3 years. I already knew that, but I listened anyway, because sometimes the most useful thing a man can do is let other people confirm what he already knows. After the call, I poured a second cup of coffee and pulled up the tracking app on my phone. The app was linked to the GPS tag I placed, legally, as it was a jointly owned vehicle, on Nadine's car 7 months ago. According to the log, her car was still at the Clearwater Palms Resort. She hadn't left. That told me she didn't know yet. Or she knew and was paralyzed. By 10:15, I had my answer. Her first call came in at 10:22. I watched the screen light up. Let go to voicemail. She called again at 10:28. Then texted, Clayton, call me right now. Then, 2 minutes later, the cards aren't working. What did you do? I set the phone face down on the desk and went to check the mail. What Nadine was discovering at that resort was something I'd engineered carefully over 8 months. Our joint checking account had been restructured under a spousal asset separation protocol. Perfectly standard, perfectly legal, that I'd initiated the previous February through Bridgepoint's own internal procedures. I knew the process inside and out. The joint investment account had been similarly restructured, with my contributions, which represented 83% of the total balance based on documented income records, moved to a separate account in my name. Her remaining portion sat in a holding account pending the divorce proceedings I'd already filed 3 weeks prior. Her platinum card, which ran through the joint account, was dead. Her backup card, also connected to joint credit, was dead. The corporate card she used for Veritan expenses was, by now, almost certainly frozen by Russell Holt's team. She was at a luxury resort with no working cards and a man who was about to face his own set of very serious problems. She called 4 more times before noon. The last one she left a voicemail. Her voice was controlled, but barely. She said she needed to talk to me, that there had been a massive misunderstanding, that whatever she'd heard, she could explain. She said the word explain 3 times. I didn't call back. What I did instead was drive 40 minutes to Grant Donovan's office and spend 2 hours reviewing the divorce filing strategy. Grant was methodical and calm, which was why I'd chosen him. He confirmed that the financial separation I'd executed was airtight. He also brought up something I hadn't anticipated. Nadine's attorney reached out this morning, Grant said, sliding a printed email across the desk. Brenda Sutton. She's filing a motion to freeze your accounts pending equitable distribution review. I read the email. On what grounds? She's claiming you acted unilaterally without disclosure. I looked up at him. I used the bank's standard spousal asset restructuring protocol. Every document was filed through proper channels. She had joint access to all account notifications. Grant nodded. I know. The motion won't hold, but it tells us something interesting. She already had an attorney ready. I said. Retained 8 months ago, Grant said. Brenda Sutton's office confirmed the engagement date when I called to introduce myself. I sat with that for a moment. Nadine had been planning this, too, just not as carefully and not as early. I'd filed 3 weeks ago. She'd retained an attorney 8 months ago and done nothing with it. That was the difference between someone who intends to act and someone who actually does. On the drive home, my phone rang. Dana Payne. I answered. Dana's voice was quiet and tight. She'd seen the Instagram post the previous day, Nadine and Derek poolside, his arm around her chair, and had spent the night making her own calls. A friend at Veritan had confirmed the compliance investigation. She'd spoken to her own attorney that morning. I just want you to know, she said, that I'm not angry at you. I think what you did took real nerve. I did what needed doing, I said. Derek called me last night trying to spin it, she said. He said Nadine had pressured him, that it wasn't what it looked like. He said the same thing to me. I told her. I recorded that conversation, if it's useful to you. A pause. It would be, she said. Yes. I'll have Grant send it to your attorney by end of day. She thanked me. We hung up. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, thinking about the kind of woman who stands up straight when everything is falling and the kind of man who helped her do it. I was in the backyard with Duke on Tuesday morning when Hazel called. My daughter was 25, a data analyst at a logistics firm in Charlotte, and the kind of person who thought in systems, cause, effect, variable, outcome. She'd always been more like me than like her mother, which I suspected Nadine had quietly resented for years. Dad, she said, and her voice had that particular steadiness that told me she'd been sitting with something difficult and had decided to say it anyway. I need to tell you something, and I need you to not make it weird. Go ahead, I said. I've known about Derek for almost a year, she said. Mom mentioned him enough times that I started doing my own digging. I'm a data analyst, Dad. Patterns aren't exactly hard for me to spot. I sat down on the back steps. Duke pressed his head against my knee. I know, I said. I know you knew. A pause. You knew I knew. I figured it out about 4 months ago, I said. The way you stopped asking about your mother's work trips. The way you changed the subject when Derek's name came up at Christmas. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I didn't know how to tell you. You didn't have to, I said. You were in a position nobody should be in. I don't hold that against you. What Hazel didn't know, not fully, was how much she'd already helped me without realizing it. 7 months ago, she'd been home for a long weekend and had spent an evening at my desk helping me learn a new data visualization tool for work. In the process, she'd shown me how to cross-reference large document sets for duplicate metadata patterns. She thought she was teaching her technologically cautious father a new professional skill. What she was actually doing was giving me the method I used to identify Nolan Graves. I hadn't told her that. I wasn't sure I needed to. But sitting on those back steps, I decided she deserved to know she'd been part of something that mattered. When I told her, she was silent for a long moment. Then she let out a breath that was halfway between a laugh and something else entirely. So, I helped you build a case, she said. You gave me the method, I said. The rest was mine. Does Evan know any of this? Not yet, I said. And that's going to be a harder conversation. It was. I called Evan that evening. My son was 28, working in product development at a tech firm in Denver, and he'd always had his mother's instinct for narrative. He heard the story he wanted to hear and built his interpretation around it. When I told him what had happened, what I'd documented, what had been filed, his first response wasn't shock. It was suspicion. Dad, this sounds like you've been planning this for a long time, he said. That's not exactly normal behavior. Neither is what your mother was doing, I said. I'm not defending her, he said quickly. I'm just saying, recording people, filing packets, restructuring accounts, that's a lot. It is, I agreed. It's also what the situation required. He didn't have much to say to that. We ended the call on uneasy terms. 2 days later, the uneasy terms got worse. Evan posted on Instagram a vague but pointed caption about control and manipulation and not everything being what it seems. His followers were mostly friends and colleagues, but the implication was clear enough to anyone who knew the context. I read the post once, then called Hazel. I saw it, she said before I could speak. Leave it, I said. He'll figure it out. He always does eventually, she said. He's just slower than he thinks he is. That same afternoon, I got a call for Vincent Archer, Veridan's VP of Compliance. The internal investigation had been formally opened. Derek Payne had been suspended pending review. Nolan Graves had been placed on administrative leave. And Derek, Vincent told me, had submitted a written statement to HR claiming that Nadine Merritt had used her seniority to pressure him into the financial arrangements, and that he had felt unable to refuse. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When Vincent finished, I said, Is that on record? It's a formal HR submission, Vincent said. Good, I said. Make sure it's dated and preserved. It's going to be relevant. I already knew what Derek was doing. It was the oldest play in the book. When the walls close in, point at someone else, and call yourself a victim. The irony was that his statement, intended to shift blame, had actually confirmed the core of everything I'd submitted. He just put his own signature on the timeline. Some men never learn that the cover-up is always worse than the crime. Derek Payne was apparently one of them. I've worked in financial investigation long enough to know that once a document leaves your hands, you stop controlling it. You can aim it carefully, follow properly, structure it so the impact lands where you intend, but the downstream effects belong to the current, not to you. By Thursday, the current was moving fast. I found out about the employee forum through Lester Crane. He'd sent me a text at 6:40 in the morning that said simply, "You should look at this," followed by a link. Lester was 45, former senior account coordinator at Veridan Pharma, and one of the sharper people I'd ever met in a professional context. Nadine had pushed him out 18 months ago during a departmental restructuring she'd engineered, what she called a strategic reallocation of talent resources, what Lester had called getting walked to the door because he'd flagged an expense irregularity she didn't want flagged. We'd been introduced through a mutual contact 7 months after that. He'd shared what he knew. I'd incorporated it, properly attributed, into the documentation I sent to Veridan. The forum he'd linked was an off-site message board. Not official Veridan property, technically unaffiliated, the kind of platform HR departments pretend doesn't exist, and employees used to say the things they won't put in writing anywhere traceable. The top thread had been live for 14 hours. The title, Director of Sales. Remember the name. I read through it on my laptop over coffee. It was not kind. Screenshots of Nadine's Instagram posts, the resort photo, the champagne, the caption about deserving it, alongside printed excerpts from what appeared to be internal expense logs. Someone had done their own digging, or had access I didn't know about. The thread had over 240 replies. Several came from people I recognized by username, from Lester's descriptions. A few came from names I didn't recognize at all. Near the bottom, one post stopped me. The username was inactive, no profile photo, no post history beyond this single entry. The text read, "She told me I lack the polish to represent a brand. Some of us just represent something different." I knew who that was. Todd Geary, the regional partner who'd left Veriton 5 years ago when Nadine had quietly dismantled his role in the same restructuring playbook she'd later used on Lester. He'd never said a public word about it. Until now. I texted Lester. "Geary's on the thread." Lester replied within 30 seconds. "I saw." He waited a long time. "Some men do," I typed back. "Doesn't make them wrong." I closed the laptop and called Grant. I wanted to make sure the forum activity didn't complicate our legal position. Grant confirmed it didn't. The thread contained no material from my submission, and anything posted there was independent third-party commentary. Our filings were clean. That afternoon, Nadine finally came home. I heard the car in the driveway at 2:15. I was at my desk. Duke lifted his head, listened, then put it back down. I didn't move. She came through the front door without knocking, which was still technically her right since the divorce hadn't been finalized. I heard her set her bag down in the hall, heard the deliberate click of her heels on the tile. Then she appeared in the doorway of my office. She looked composed. That had always been her first defense. Composure is armor. But I'd spent 29 years learning to read the gap between what Nadine showed and what Nadine felt, and the gap that afternoon was wide. "I'd like to know," she said, "exactly what you thought you were doing." I leaned back in my chair. "I filed a compliance disclosure with your employer. I separated the joint accounts according to applicable law, and I filed for divorce 3 weeks ago. Your attorney has the paperwork." Her jaw tightened slightly. "You had no right to go to my company. Your company's ethics policy," I said, "gives any individual with documented evidence of financial misconduct the right to submit a formal disclosure. I helped write a similar policy for a bank client 4 years ago. The language is standard." "This was personal," she said. "This was about us." "It stopped being just about us," I said, "when company funds started paying for your weekends." She took a step into the room. "Derek told HR," I pressured him. "That's going to come back on you." "Derek's statement corroborates my timeline," I said. "Whatever he intended it to do, that's what it does." She stared at me for a long moment. Something moved through her expression. Not remorse, exactly. More like the recalculation that happens when a plan fails and you're trying to build a new one in real time. "Clayton," she said, and her voice dropped a register. "We've been together 30 years. 29, I said. "And yes, I'm aware." She left 20 minutes later. Didn't take anything. Didn't say goodbye to Duke. The door clicked shut behind her the same way it had on my birthday morning, except this time it felt like a different kind of ending. A cleaner one. 3 weeks before my birthday, I'd stood at a podium in a Marriott conference room in Cincinnati and delivered a 40-minute presentation to a regional compliance professionals association on the topic of documentation integrity in internal investigations. I hadn't mentioned Nadine. I hadn't mentioned Veriton. I hadn't mentioned any of the 14 months of work sitting in a folder on my desktop. I'd spoken in general terms about methodology, about the importance of clean metadata chains, about how most corporate fraud cases fail not because the fraud was sophisticated, but because the response wasn't. About 60 people had been in the room. 12 of them, I would later learn, worked in industries adjacent to pharmaceutical sales. 3 of them knew people at Veriton. I found out about the ripple effect from an unexpected source. Lester forwarded me a LinkedIn message he'd received from a woman named Patricia Odom, a compliance manager at a competing pharma distributor, who'd attended my presentation and recognized my name when it appeared in connection with the Veriton investigation. Patricia told Lester that my talk had prompted her team to run an internal audit of their own discretionary accounts. They'd found irregularities. I wasn't responsible for that. I also wasn't surprised by it. The more immediate effect of the conference was closer to home. Vincent Archer, Veriton's VP of Compliance, had apparently mentioned to Russell Holt that the submission they'd received bore structural similarities to a framework presented at the Cincinnati conference. Russell had pulled the presentation notes and read them. He called me Thursday afternoon. "I have to ask," Russell said. "Did you design that presentation knowing this was coming?" "I designed it because it was accurate," I said. "The timing was mine to manage." A pause. "You know," he said, "I've been in this industry since before your wife joined the company. I've dealt with compliance issues of every kind. What I haven't seen before is someone this prepared." "With respect," I said, "you probably have. You just didn't know it at the time." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "We're going to need to restructure the sales leadership position. The ethics and compliance framework around it is going to require significant work. Your name has come up internally as someone who could consult on that process." I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was surprised. I thought this was possible, but because I wanted to think it through clearly before I said yes. "Let me speak with my attorney," I said, "and I'll want full written scope of engagement before any conversation goes further." "Of course," Russell said. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a while, turning the idea over. Duke was asleep under the window, one ear twitching in a dream. Outside, the street was quiet. The mailbox at the end of the driveway stood empty. 3 weeks ago, I'd slid an envelope into that mailbox like dropping a match into dry kindling. Now the fire had traveled further than I'd planned, and instead of burning me out, it had somehow cleared the ground for something new. I wasn't sentimental about it. I'm not that kind of man. But I noted it, the way you note any data point that doesn't fit your original model, carefully, and with the understanding that it might matter later. That evening, Hazel called to tell me Evan had deleted his Instagram post. He hadn't called me yet, but the post was gone. He looked at the documents, Hazel said. I sent him the sections about the startup funding. I hadn't known she'd done that. How'd he take it? Like someone who just realized the foundation of a building he was standing in wasn't what he thought it was, she said. That's a very precise image, I said. I'm a data analyst, she said. Precision is the job. Grant Donovan called me on a Friday morning with the kind of measured enthusiasm attorneys allow themselves when something goes better than expected. The motion to freeze your accounts has been denied, he said. Judge ruled this morning. Brenda Sutton filed a supplemental argument claiming procedural misconduct in the asset restructuring. The judge found it had no merit. Your documentation held. I was standing at the kitchen counter making toast. Duke was watching me from his spot by the back door with a particular attention he reserved for mornings when food was involved. What's Sutton's next move? I asked. She'll push for equitable distribution review, Grant said. Standard play. She'll argue that the separation of the investment account was disproportionate. We have the income documentation to counter that, but she'll make it take time. That's fine, I said. We have time. What we also had, as of that same morning, was something I hadn't anticipated, a gift from Nadine's own carelessness. 3 months before any of this became public, I had been using the shared family laptop to print a tax document when I'd noticed a PDF sitting open in the Downloads folder. The file name was innocuous, Planning Notes Rev 3, but something about it made me pause. I opened it. It was a 40-page document prepared by a financial planning attorney. Not Brenda Sutton. A different firm entirely. The document was titled Asset Disposition Strategy, Pre-Divorce Planning. It was dated 11 months ago. Nadine's name was on the cover page as the client. I'd read it carefully. Then I'd photographed every page with my phone, transferred the images to a secure folder, and put the laptop back exactly where I'd found it. The document outlined a strategy for minimizing my share of the marital estate. It included proposals for reclassifying certain jointly acquired assets as Nadine's separate property, using creative attribution of her professional contributions to inflate her claim on the investment account, and, most relevant, transferring a portion of shared equity in our vacation property in Michigan to Evan's name before filing, thereby removing it from the marital estate. She hadn't executed that last piece, but she'd intended to. And now it was in my folder, dated and photographed, ready to be introduced the moment Brenda Sutton started making arguments about equitable conduct. I told Grant about it on the call. There was a brief silence. You've had this for 3 months, he said. I wanted to see if she'd follow through on the transfer, I said. She didn't move fast enough. Another pause. Clayton, is there anything else you have that I don't know about? Probably, I said. I'll send you the full inventory this afternoon. He laughed, short, dry, the laugh of a man who was simultaneously exasperated and impressed. Please do. The Michigan property came up again 2 days later, this time in a different context. Nadine had called Evan over the weekend, and whatever she told him had apparently included a version of the pre-divorce planning that cast the Michigan transfer as something she'd been doing for the kids, a gift, a legacy, a motherly gesture. Evan had called me Sunday evening, cautious but curious. She said the cabin was going to be split between me and Hazel. He said that she'd been working on it for a while. She had been working on it. I said, I have a planning document. It was a legal strategy to remove the property from the marital estate before filing. Your name was going to be on the deed. You would have been an unwitting participant in an asset concealment scheme. Silence. The intent, I continued, was to make it look like a gift while using it to reduce what I'd receive in the divorce. If it had gone through, you could have faced legal complications as a named party. Another long silence. She didn't tell me any of that. Evan said quietly. No, I said. She wouldn't have. By Monday, Evan had called Hazel. By Tuesday, Hazel had called me to say that Evan wanted to see the full documentation. I told her to give him my number and let him come to it on his own terms. He called Wednesday morning. We talked for an hour. At the end of it, he asked me a single question. Did she ever actually plan to split it with me and Hazel equally? Or was I just the name on the form? Based on the document, I said, you were the name on the form. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, okay, I understand. That was the last thing he said on the subject. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a declaration. It was just a man arriving at a conclusion after looking at the facts, which is all I'd ever asked him to do. The HR meeting was scheduled for a Thursday at 10 in the morning at Veridan's regional headquarters in a glass and chrome building off the interstate that always looked to me like it was trying too hard to signal its own importance. I wasn't invited. I was the one who'd submitted the documentation. My role was done, but Grant had arranged for me to be available by phone if any clarification was needed on specific sections of the packet, and Vincent Archer had confirmed the previous day that the investigation had reached a stage where the formal disciplinary meetings were imminent. Nadine walked into that building at 9:58, according to the security log Vincent later shared with me. She walked in the way she always walked into professional spaces, shoulders back, chin level, the projection of a woman who belonged there and knew it. Whatever she felt underneath that projection, she'd learned decades ago not to let it show on the approach. The room held Russell Holt, Vincent Archer, a woman named Patricia from the corporate legal team, and an HR director named Carl Whitfield. No familiar faces. No one who owed her a favor. No one who'd been charmed by her over a client dinner or a conference cocktail hour. What followed, as Carl later summarized to Vincent, who later summarized to me, was a meeting that lasted 1 hour and 17 minutes. Nadine opened by asserting that the investigation was procedurally improper and that the documentation had been compiled through an invasion of her professional privacy. Russell responded by placing the signed ethics disclosure form, the one she had personally acknowledged when she joined the company, on the table in front of her. It included a clause explicitly authorizing third-party submission of documented evidence by any individual with standing. She pivoted. She argued that Derek had acted independently and that she had been unaware of the extent of the financial reclassifications. Patricia from legal placed a printed transcript of one of the audio recordings on the table. Nadine's voice, clear as anything, laughing about a receipt, naming the folder where the files had been moved. She asked who had provided the audio. Carl told her it was submitted as part of a formal disclosure packet filed by an independent contractor with documented standing. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "My husband." Carl said nothing. "He was never employed by this company," she said. "He had no standing to submit anything." Patricia spoke up. "The ethics policy defines standing as any individual in possession of primary evidence obtained through lawful means. Your husband held joint access to several relevant accounts and platforms. His standing was reviewed and confirmed before the investigation was opened." The conversation about Derek's statement came next. Russell read the relevant section aloud. Derek's claim that Nadine had directed the financial arrangements under professional pressure. Nadine's response was immediate and sharp. She called it a fabrication. She used the word desperate. She pointed out that Derek had every incentive to shift blame. Russell nodded slowly. "That may be true," he said. But his statement and your submission describe the same sequence of events in the same order. One of you is lying about the direction of influence. Neither of you is denying the events themselves. She had no answer for that. At 11:15, Carl placed a termination letter on the table in front of her. Effective immediately. Cause: documented violation of the company's financial ethics policy, misuse of discretionary funds, and failure to disclose a personal relationship between management-tier employees as required under Section 4.1 of the Employee Conduct Agreement. She read it without picking it up. Then she looked at Russell and said, "You're really going to do this?" Russell said, "We already did." She stood, picked up her bag, walked to the door. Then she paused with her hand on the frame and turned back. Whatever she'd intended to say, she apparently decided against it. She left without speaking. Grant called me 20 minutes later. "It's done," he said. "Termination, cause-based. No severance under the ethics violation clause." Veritan's legal team confirmed. I was sitting on the back porch. Duke was stretched out in the thin October sunlight beside me. "Good," I said. "There's one more thing," Grant said. Vincent Archer called separately. "Russell wants to move forward on the consulting engagement. He'd like a meeting next week." I looked out at the yard. The maple in the corner had gone full red. Leaves were coming down in slow, unhurried intervals, the way things fall when the time is simply right. "Set it up," I said. Evan called me on a Tuesday evening, 9 days after the HR meeting, and his voice had that particular quality I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager who'd just broken something and needed to figure out how to say it. "Dad," he said, "I need to talk to you about the startup funding." I've been waiting for this call, not with dread, just the patient readiness of someone who'd known a conversation was coming and had decided not to rush it. "Go ahead," I said. He'd been doing his own digging, which I'd expected. Evan had always been the kind of person who needed to verify things himself before he could accept them, which was a quality I respected even when it complicated my life. What he'd found, after going through 3 years of his company's financial records with the help of an accountant friend, was exactly what I'd shown him in the documentation. 3 separate transfers, totaling $61,000, had moved from a Veritan discretionary account into a consulting entity that had, in turn, made strategic advisory payments to the early-stage tech fund where Evan's startup had its seed investment. The money had passed through 2 layers before touching anything with his name on it. Clean on the surface. Traceable if you knew where to look. "I didn't know," Evan said. "I know you didn't," I said. "But I benefited from it," he said. "You did," I agreed. "That's the part that matters legally." A long pause. "What do I have to do?" "Talk to Grant," I said. "He's already aware. The clean resolution is a voluntary return of the funds with documented acknowledgement that you received them without knowledge of their source. That positions you as a cooperating party rather than a named subject. Grant can walk you through the paperwork." "Will this affect the company?" he asked. The company was the one real thing he'd built, and I could hear in his voice how much it mattered. "If you move fast and cooperate fully," I said. "No. The issue is the source, not the recipient. You're downstream of the problem. That's not the same as being the problem." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I posted that thing on Instagram. About control and manipulation." "I know. I didn't have the full picture," he said. "No," I said. "You didn't. I should have called you before I posted anything," he said. "Yes," I said simply. "You should have." I didn't soften it. He didn't need me to soften it. What he needed was for me to be straight with him, which was what I'd always tried to be, even when it was easier not to. He called Grant the next morning. By Friday, the voluntary restitution documentation was drafted. Evan signed it, returned the funds through proper channels, and received a written acknowledgement from Veritan's legal team confirming his status as a non-culpable downstream recipient. The matter was closed as far as he was concerned. The day after Evan signed the papers, he drove from Denver to stay with me for a long weekend. He didn't say much when he arrived. Just put his bag in the guest room, came downstairs, and helped me stack firewood on the back porch for 2 hours without being asked. Duke approved of the visit immediately and refused to leave Evan's side for the entire weekend. On Saturday evening, we sat on the back porch with 2 mugs of coffee and watched the last of the daylight leave the yard. The maple had dropped most of its leaves by then. The yard was covered in red and gold, and neither of us was in any hurry to talk. Eventually, Evan said, "She was going to put my name on that deed and never tell me what it meant." "That's what the document shows," I said. He turned his mug in both hands. You knew about the startup funding when I posted that thing. You didn't say anything. I wanted you to come to it yourself, I said. He nodded slowly. That's a patient way to do things. It's the only way I know, I said. He stayed through Sunday. When he left Monday morning, he shook my hand at the door, firmly, the way men do when they mean it, and said, I'm sorry it took me this long, Dad. You got here, I said. That's what counts. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in late November, 4 months and 11 days after I'd walked that envelope to the mailbox on my birthday morning. Grant and I sat on one side of a long conference table. Brenda Sutton and Nadine sat on the other. The mediator was a retired judge named Patricia Callahan, who had the kind of calm that comes from having seen every variety of human conflict and emerging unimpressed by all of them. Nadine looked composed. I'll give her that, even now. She sat straight, hands folded, a woman who'd built her entire professional identity on projection and wasn't going to abandon it in a conference room. But the numbers on the table didn't care about projection. The investment account had been separated along documented contribution lines. 83% to me, 17% to her, based on income records going back to the account's opening. Brenda had fought it. Patricia had reviewed the documentation and ruled it appropriate. The Michigan cabin, the one Nadine had planned to transfer to Evan's name, was determined to be a jointly acquired marital asset, split equally. My half was assigned to Evan and Hazel through a transfer I initiated immediately after the finalization. Nadine's half went to a holding trust pending her decision. Her attorney had already indicated she intended to sell. The pre-divorce planning document, the 43-page strategy memo from Nadine's other attorney, had been introduced during mediation as evidence of intent to conceal. Patricia had noted it in her record. Brenda had objected strenuously. The objection was noted and overruled. Nadine's severance from Veriton had been voided under the ethics violation clause, which she'd signed and acknowledged when she joined the company. Her stock options, 3 years of vested equity, had been canceled under the same clause. Her IRS filing for the previous 2 years was under review, because 4 of the reclassified corporate expenditures had passed through structures that intersected with her personal tax returns. Her accountant was dealing with that, presumably not happily. When the finalization was complete, Nadine stood, picked up her bag, and looked at me across the table for a long moment. You planned this for a very long time, she said. You gave me a very long time to plan, I said. She left without responding. On the drive home, I called Hazel. She answered on the second ring. It's done, I said. Good, she said. And then, after a pause, how do you feel? I thought about it honestly. Outside the car window, the highway ran straight and gray through bare November trees. The sky was low and white, the kind that promises snow before evening. Like a man who did what needed to be done, I said, and is ready to do the next thing. 3 months later, I accepted a formal consulting engagement with Veriton Pharma as a compliance architecture advisor. The scope was narrow and fully disclosed. I had no operational authority, no access to personnel records, and no involvement in any proceedings still connected to Nadine. What I had was a mandate to review their discretionary fund oversight framework and recommend structural changes that would prevent the same vulnerabilities from being exploited again. I spent 4 months on it. The final report ran 81 pages. Russell Hull called it the most useful document his compliance team had ever received and asked if I'd consider a second engagement reviewing their vendor ethics protocols. I told him I'd think about it. I was already thinking about it. Grant called the following week with one last piece of news. Brenda Sutton had submitted a final inquiry on Nadine's behalf, asking whether I'd be willing to waive the IRS referral in exchange for a clean settlement signature on one outstanding property item. I asked Grant what he recommended. The IRS referral was made by Veriton's legal team, Grant said. It's not yours to waive. That's what I thought, I said. Tell her we can't help. Duke was asleep under my desk when I hung up. Hazel was coming for Christmas. Evan had called twice that week just to check in, something he hadn't done in years. Outside, the first real snow of December was coming down soft and steady, covering the yard, the driveway, the mailbox at the end of the walk. That mailbox. I looked at it for a long moment through the window. For months ago, I'd raised its flag like a man sending a verdict. Now it just stood there, ordinary and quiet, doing what it was built to do. Some things don't need a monument. They just need to work.